I'm not primarily interested in existential risk. My interest in the future is following the maxim, bad cases make bad law. I think it's somewhat of a mistake to focus too much on extreme scenarios until you have the middle of the distribution right. That is, if you know roughly what's going to happen, then you can start to look at the tail of variations. If you just try to imagine the extremes, I think you can go wrong. So my research agenda in the last few years, last 10 years perhaps, has been to try to take particular future scenarios defined in terms of a set of, concrete assumptions about the technology that might appear, and then work in great detail out a whole scenario of what would plausibly happen, applying physics, engineering, business, economics, political science, everything I know over a long career to try to elaborate that scenario. And I'm going to talk today about two such scenarios, although I've worked on more such things in the past. And first I'm going to describe these scenarios, the key assumptions, and then some of the implications, and then I'm going to get back at the end to describing what kind of risks are more or less likely in those scenarios, to connect it back to the theme of the conference here. All right. So one of my scenarios is the basis of this book, The Age of M, which came out last year, which I will quickly describe. The key idea, that most of you are probably familiar with, is the idea of an upload, it was once called. You take an individual human brain, you scan it and find spatial and chemical detail to see which cells of what type or where connected to what. And then you have computer models of how each kind of cell works in terms of taking signals in, changing states, sending signals out. And then you make a big computer model of that brain with matching parts which match to the cells and match to the connections and match to the models of the cells. And if you can make good enough models and a good enough scan, then by definition, when you make this good big computer model, it should have the same overall input-output behavior. So you could hook it up with artificial eyes, ears, hands, mouth. You could talk to it, it would talk back. You might ask it to do things, it would do them. And it would behave exactly the same in the same situation, but it would start to have a new world and behave differently. And if this were cheap, it could change a lot. And so the book goes into great detail. In fact, it's less of an easy read because I tried to be encyclopedic. I took as my challenge to say as many plausible things as I possibly could about this world to convince you it is really possible to say a lot. And so it's dense full of those things. I'm only going to mention a tiny fraction of them here now. But key assumptions, just to be clear, the same input-output behavior as the original. Relatively opaque, so for a time at least, although you can make a copy of a brain, you don't really understand it enough to edit it in great detail, although you may have some tweaks you can do to it. Roughly assume standard economic analysis of, say, supply and demand, i.e. a relatively decentralized world, nobody's in charge, things happen not because anybody wants them as the net effect of individual selfish behavior. And this has key consequences that these emulations can be copied and they can be run at different speeds. And some of the main consequences I have, all the humans have to retire pretty much all at once. Initially, scans are destructive, but many humans still choose to go become Ms because they can have a more luxurious, exciting life there as emulations, if you believe that that's still you. The humans who are left behind, they own most of the capital in this world, so this economy will start doubling roughly every month, very roughly, and so their wealth will be doubling roughly every month. The humans who have any sort of wealth will then have a lot of it. The emulations themselves, they will very quickly have such a large population that their wages fall to their subsistence levels, which is well below human subsistence levels, but still they're enjoying their lives. They mostly spend their work and leisure life in virtual reality, in which they need no pain, hunger, disease, crime. Their bodies are always beautiful, but they are working most of the time. Most of them are copies of the few hundred most productive humans, so they are elite compared to humans, at the level of a billionaire, Nobel Prize winner, Olympic gold medalist, that sort of thing. They're all that good compared to humans, and they know it. So they may look at humans with nostalgia, perhaps gratitude, not so much respect. The emulations will concentrate into a small number of very dense cities because in virtual reality they can commute much more easily and cheaply, and therefore they can have big dense cities. These are some of the main implications about the Age of M, but again, the book goes into great, great detail. And a little bit later in the talk, I'll tell you a bit more about some of the risks that might be more or less in that scenario. But now I want to switch and talk more about a different scenario, the one I've been working on more lately. This is funded by a grant from the Open Philanthropy Foundation that I've been working on. It's a 3-year grant, about halfway through, well, third of the way through. And this is imagining what happens if emulations, it's not focused directly on emulations, although we'll talk about that in a moment. The question is, what other kind of software might become the basis of human-level artificial intelligence? And that's a very common question, and I took a couple of polls on my Twitter feed, each of which got about 300 responses, and so let me give you some answers to those polls for context here. One, I asked people if they are interested in AI risk, why, and I gave them 3 options plus other. The 3 options were FOOM, some explosive growth scenario, or local explosive growth. Second, a value drift where the default values aren't the values you like. Third, loss of property rights, i.e. Humans get their stuff stolen. Or fourth, other. And the answer was 37% FOOM, 28% value drift, 18% property rights loss, and 17% other. So most people think they know the answer, and the most common answer is FOOM. Relatedly, I asked in a separate poll, if you imagine a future full of software, what is that software like? I gave as the 4 options. Like the software you know today, or like the software we have in human brains, or another kind of software, or I can't tell. 33% couldn't tell here, a lot more. Only 13% thought it was like humans. Only 16% thought it would be like the software we write today, and 38% said other. So there's a strong belief that there's just going to be this radically new kind of software that might appear, and that's presumably related to the concern about FOOM, that whenever somebody discovers the key secret to this new kind of software, then there would be a FOOM burst at that moment. So I also asked conditionally, assume the only kind of software in the future is software like in our brains, or software like the software we've been writing for 70 years. In that case, I asked which wins, brain-like, the software we've been writing like, both win out in different areas, or I can't tell. And only 17% thought they couldn't tell. Now they have relatively confident answers here. And 17% only thought the ordinary software kind would win, 24% thought the brain would win, but 42% thought they would both win in big places. So, conditional on no new kind of software showing up, people seem to think brain-like software can win. It has a chance to be a big part of the future. So, this motivates me to make as the key assumption of my scenario analysis that there is no other kind of software, ever. What if, at least for the duration we're interested in, there's only ever the kind of software we've been writing or the kind of software in our brains? That's it. You might not think that's entirely plausible, but it's a concrete set of assumptions I can work with, like I did in the Age of M, to work out consequences. So, now, there would be a couple of other kinds of software implicitly. You could do some sort of merging of the two. You might think of deep learning or the neuromorphic AI as that. You inspired by pieces of the brain, but you still do it in a more software-like way that we've been doing. And also there's software where we take software today and we make it write other software. It's software squared, if you will. And that could have a different character. Now my job is to try to predict the future given this assumption. Now, I can make one great prediction right off the bat, which might surprise you. It's based on something called Conway's Law. Conway's Law is the observation from many decades ago that when you have an organization with some org chart that makes software, and then the software has some sort of modular decomposition structure, they're the same structure. The software structure that's written matches the organization structure consistently over time. That tells you a big thing. It tells you that while modularity is important, the exact decomposition isn't so important. So when organizations have a desire to keep communication lines according to the organization, the software is typically able to be adapted with that structure without great performance penalties. It matters that there is a structure, it doesn't matter which structure it is so much. So that tells me right off that the future world, if we now are imagining a future world where humans are sometimes or often or always replaced with software, and some of the future software could be software like we've written, some of it could be software like the software in human brains, either some mixture or emulations, or some descendants of emulations, that this whole world could look a lot like our world in the sense of the structure of industries, nations, cities, professions, firms, divisions in firms, jobs as clumps of tasks. We are in a world with a detailed structure like that, and that structure could largely continue. We would swap out individual people doing individual tasks, and we would have software doing those tasks, but the whole structure could remain. That means the world doesn't have to look as strange. Of course, over time, industries have changed, and firms have changed, and professions have changed, so you should expect that, at least a similar degree of change there, but the world could continue on like that. Okay, now to go farther, what I need is some conceptual way to think about how humans are different from software, human software. That is, to go further, I want to say, well, where will I expect to see human-like software continue on the longest and the most successfully, and where will I expect software like the software we know that we write to continue on longest, or these other kinds. So now I need a model, a theory of what the essential difference is, or what one of the essential differences that I can use to make projections. And that's the kind of reason I signed up for this project, because that's fun to think about that. And I think I've come up with something. So let's start with some candidates. One thing you could say is, one of the features about human software is it comes in this one package of the brain. In order to have a human do anything, you really have to assign a whole brain to do that thing. And brains merge hardware and software together, so you really have to assign a whole big chunk of hardware together with its matched chunk of software together to do any task, even no matter how trivial the task. So that's been a big urge for us to write software to automate things, because many things people used to do, at least, were pretty damn simple. And so you could write a pretty small piece of software with a pretty small piece of hardware, and that could just substitute for a human, and that was a huge win. So it's clearly that's been one of the ways in which we've decided which things to have humans do, which things to have software do. It's just the size of the task in terms of how much software and hardware you need to do it. Another sort of principle you might think is that humans have this integration of learning and doing in the structure of their brains, and we tend to separate those things. We have separate modules that do learning and separate modules that have doing. And wherever learning is more important, or an integrated learning is more important, then human-like things might be doing more of that. That's a relatively weak guess. You might also notice that human brains also, instead of separating memory and processing, they merge them all together, and human brains also don't synchronize things as well. And there are many observations about differences between human software and others, and I'm going to pull them all together into one grand theme. And that theme is degree of integration, or modularity. So when we write software, we want to do a task, and we write a piece of software to do the task, and then we have another task, and we could take the old piece of software and try to pull out the part that was like, or change it to make it do the new task, but often we just start to write a new piece of code to do the new task. We collect lots of modules to do different things, and then we put them together in some relatively modular structure that lets us go change each one without affecting the others too much. The human brain involved in an environment would have this limited capacity. It couldn't just go write a new piece of code to do each new thing. That would take away from the hardware software package available to do the other things. And so it more had to stick with a limited capacity and just keep changing them and reintegrating them and restructuring them in order to stay within the limited capacity and still get better. So the evolution spent a long time honing the integration of the package of tools that's in your brain. And that's one way of thinking about the key difference between the software in your brain and the software that we write, is the degree of modularity versus integration. The human brain is this great package of integrated tools. Now, so far, because it comes with the hardware, you have to spend the whole package on doing anything, and if you can do something much cheaper, you do. But this gives us a sense for where or it's the entire human future in a sense. Where would humans last in a competitive world? So now we're not just thinking of humans as rich capitalist retirees off on the side running things if they can keep control and wondering if they can. We're talking now about whether humans, as descendants of humans, variations on humans, can last and be competitive and win as becoming part of the future doing things. Many people seem to think that's just crazy, and I want to try to convince you that's not. So, consider for a moment, today we have people who do tasks. We have big data sets on who does which task where. And we can look at, for any one task anyone does, what other kinds of tasks are being done in the same geographic area. And people have done this analysis. And therefore you can find some tasks are being done near many other tasks. That is, whenever A is done, B is done nearby. And other kinds of tasks are not so done near others. And I'm going to call the first kind tangled. Tangled tasks. So tangled tasks are the ones that are just, they need to coordinate with a lot of other tasks. And untangled tasks need to coordinate with fewer. Now, in our world, tangled tasks tend to happen in the city centers and mostly more in the biggest city centers. And those people who do them tend to be paid more, and it's worth more to have them be smart and well-educated, etc., because it's just worth more to pay attention carefully how to do a tangled task. But that makes those tasks harder to automate, and will more often be automating the tasks that are less tangled, where there are fewer other interfaces you have to match in order to replace a human with a machine. And so, this idea of tangling or integration, I think, encompasses already the idea of that the brain integrates hardware and software together, learning and doing, etc., memory and processing. It's just this integrated package. And in these tangled tasks is the place where humans can last longer, or human-like things can last longer, for several reasons. One is, in a tangled task, it's more important that you consider a wider context and integrate it all well. And human brains are good at doing that integration because they are this integrated package that can integrate things well. And also, humans become entrenched there. So in those places, they have to interface with regulators and lawyers and public relations and all these things they have to get right. And those are all interfacing to other human systems. And so the people who do those things do them in a human way with interfaces that are matched to humans. And so humans can just last longer sitting in those slots because they are matched to humans. So that is a scenario for human-like things, not exactly human. You're imagining that there's a competitive world and people are taking things like emulations and software and they are modifying them opportunistically as they can to get things done, but they last. So the human brain itself has more and less tangled parts. There are the key networks by which we communicate, and the brain communicates, the conscious network and the unconscious, and those, when people in the future try to modify human brains like EMS in order to do things, they'll be more likely to first modify the untangled parts. The parts you can just swap out a thing without messing with the whole rest of the architecture. Whereas the overall architecture and how it deals with the outside world, those might become more entrenched, as standards often do, and last longer. So you should then imagine a future world where in the most tangled places of the job network of tasks, there are more human-like things. If you looked in detail there, they're no longer quite so human-like, but the large-scale structure of having memory and feelings and language and things like that, the large-scale structure could still remain, because that's the thing that becomes most entrenched and tangled. And we could also think about, in this world, what happens when most of the software is written by software. First of all, we can think that today, when people learn jobs, part of what they learn is before they get to a job, and then there's on-the-job training. So plausibly, part of the software written in the new world is written within the firms that are doing particular things. There's car companies that, in part, write the software to do car-specific things, and then there's more general software companies that write general software that might be purchased by the car companies. You can also think that for each job and task somebody does today, most people do many tasks on the job, and there are often meta-tasks associated with the job that, as long as you have a full person there, you might as well let the full person do because they know a lot about the context. So you might have a truck driver, and they're usually just driving a truck, but sometimes they have to decide which truck to drive, or what to do when it's stuck, or etc. And I would call those more meta-tasks, and they require a higher level integration of information. And those meta-tasks may now be more separated. That is, at the moment, your brain is just this package. It does simple trivial things and meta things together, and you can't separate them. But here in this new world, the palette loader may have a simple palette loader to do it simply, and then invoke a meta, more complicated version software when it needs to do more meta tasks, like should this job be done at all, should it be quit, how do I deal with an accident, etc. And that'll matter in a minute. The software squared, software written by software, if the main difference between human mind and software is modularity and versus integration, we should expect the software squared to become even more modular and even less integrated. The moment when a human writes code, at least they have a piece of the code in their mind and using this whole big powerful brain to integrate that piece, and at least small chunks are integrated. And when software is writing software, it doesn't even integrate it at that scale. And so you should expect software squared to have even more troubles with fragility and the benefits of modularity, but the costs as well. So now today we have some analogs to think about. In our world, we have often examples of things like human brain software versus other software. Let me just give you some analogs. Think of a local restaurant that's been adapting to local situations in a town or something for a long time and knows the people and what they like, etc., versus a franchise that comes in and dumps a standard thing and repeats it everywhere. Second is more modular, more scalable, but the first is more adapted to local circumstances. There's also the difference between modern farming and, say, what they call permaculture farming, where it's very attempted to be highly integrated between the different crops you're growing and the location and the details of things. And again, that can be more efficient as long as you don't consider the cost of changing it or adapting it or scaling it and transferring it to other places. And think of cells in the body. So this is, I think, a really instructive example. Our cells we are multicellular animals. And at some point, there was an ecological niche for big creatures. And previously, there had been these small creatures. And you might think, these small creatures, these small cells, they have to do everything all by themselves, right? Including they have to have a boundary that protects them and have sensors to see what's going on near them. And you might think, well, for a big creature, you would just have a big version of that. If you just copy lots of cells and paste them together, you have all this waste and all this extra thing a cell is doing that now it doesn't really need to do because it's part of this big organism. But even so, nature, that was its best path. It patched together cells because a cell was such a great integrated package of features that couldn't really be changed or scaled as sort of a legacy system. And it was better just to inherit that legacy system of the integrated cell rather than try to redesign it entirely or take out all the parts and design a much bigger thing that was a big organism. So we can make that similar intuition about the future of software. We can say, human mind is this wonderful package. It's wonderfully integrated. We spent all this time working out that integration. It's a legacy system. It's hard to change. But it's such a great package that future software may just use it as a package for a long time, just like multicellular organisms use cells for a long time, because it's been so well worked out. They will be making other more modular software, but they can't be bothered to just make other things bigger that are really well integrated. They'll just take this well integrated package and keep using it. So in this picture, this is a future of humanity in some sense, as the cells of this larger structure is packages that really work together well. Of course, even today the cells in your body aren't quite the same as an independent cell. Some of the features have been degraded and changed, but still a lot of the structure is pretty much the same. So now let's talk about risks. So if we just think about EMS, the world of EMS, either of these worlds grow much faster as soon as they get going, and that speeds us past risks like asteroids or volcanoes, at least. So that's an advantage. We have a sense, at least in the, so for biology, we become less vulnerable to biological disasters like plagues. On the other hand, biology probably dies faster because this world doesn't need it. Both kinds of worlds are probably crammed into a few dense cities, which makes them more vulnerable to, say, a war, a nuke, EMP or something. They'll be more focused there. Governance will matter more as it does in cities. And for EMS, and probably also for the other kind of software, mind reading becomes more possible, so totalitarian states become more feasible. and actually democracy becomes a little less feasible. In the world of M's, you do have a bit less variety and a bit less of the forager values that many people celebrate, or return to farmer values, as I discuss in my book. When we look at the other scenario of AI as software, I think, again, we see that the sooner that human software can be competitive, i.e. on the same sort of hardware, copied, mixed and matched, etc., then the sooner it could become entrenched or keep its entrenchment in certain jobs that are the more tangled jobs, and the longer it could plausibly last. The longer you wait until humans can move out of this hardware to another hardware, the more chance there is for other kinds of software to substitute and then become entrenched. Now, some people, I just got some quotes out of Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, and he has some discussion of M's and neuromorphic software, and he sees that the M's or neuromorphic software are less safe because they don't give you any guarantees. You can't prove theorems about their safety. There's no comprehensive overall design that you can inspect to be clear that the design is safe. And therefore he prefers other kinds of software that you have a theorem about, or some high-level architecture you could think you can offer guarantees about, and then he's very skeptical even about multipolar scenarios because he wants a single thing running everything with the good design. I'm just more skeptical that you're ever going to have something that clean at the larger scale organization. Already, your body design is messy, our institution and worlds are messy, and so I think having creatures like humans continue on with something like human values, it might well change, and something like a human style of thinking, I think we just feel better about seeing things like ourselves continue on, and my main claim is here, they have a chance. It's not crazy, because once we're no longer tied to this hardware and we can use the same software, then it's about which kind of software is competitive, and your brains really are this remarkable package of integrated software that we aren't close to substituting for. And you should also just realize, your brain is all these modules put together. At the smallest level, they might be little packets that you could model with a little machine learning algorithm, but those packets are in all the other animals that aren't humans. The thing that makes humans different from all the other animals is the larger scale organization of which packets are set with which parameters connected to which, so that the whole thing actually does a great job in a modern world. And that's the thing that we don't fully understand, and we may not fully understand for a long time, but we may just have this integrated package that works and keep doing stuff with it. And that's all I'm going to say for now.
Thank you, Robin. We now have about 10 minutes for questions before coffee.
Robin, who would be the first person who will be uploaded, and is it possible that he gets some kind of advantage to become global dictator or something like this?
Most likely the first venture to create uploads would be a big venture with a lot of capital invested in it, and therefore there would be many investors who would be concerned that the one guy who was running it would take it over and do it, make it his empire. So there's no doubt they would put some controls in. But also just, at the beginning, the people who would have that sort of control are going to be old people. They're not going to be young. And the M world is a different world and it needs you to adapt to it. And so the most useful M humans to scan for the M world are most likely kids, who are then young enough to adapt and learn different ways, and you make a scan of a very promising kid, and then you can train it in different ways. So if you start with a 60-year-old CEO of this company, even though he's smart, he's not very flexible, and he's really not going to be able to do learn whole new professions very well to be able to fill out all these jobs that need to be doing. So that's just not very plausible. Maybe him and a team of 20 of his best friends could fill out a wider range of the tasks, but even so, they're all old. And so maybe they could get their young friends, but I do estimate that a few hundred humans are enough. I do think 3 or 4 is too few. Yeah. Humans are varied enough in their mental skills, and jobs vary enough that you would want more than a couple in order to just have the best person for each job.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the software security problems. In a world dependent on software, obviously software security might actually be quite important for existential risk. And software squared, if that is kind of relatively crappy software but very, very distributed, That sounds like there could be a vulnerability. And of course, if we keep these human brain-sized packages, if they get replicated widely, even in the M case where you only have kind of 300 basic brain structure, that seems to suggest that we're going to be a lot of shared vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. I expect a substantial fraction of the economy to be spent on security, both defense and offense. I don't know, I doubt it would go beyond 50%, but we'd certainly spend a lot on that. And I don't know, I have friends who do computer security that tell me if you just do it right from the beginning with a good operating system and thing, it's much easier. They have capability-based security, and they haven't won so far, because usually when people are writing software, they're trying to go really fast and get something out to market first. But it could be later on, if those people suffer security events large enough, people will learn that they have to take their time and do it right. Otherwise, nobody wants your product. But that isn't the world today. So presumably, as security concerns become larger, people have the availability to switch to these more robust, safe strategies in how they write software. And it's just a matter of how quickly they switch. But knowing that that's available says the world can be reasonable, even if it wouldn't be reasonable if we kept doing what we're doing now.
Yeah, if you look at the limits of biomimicking and look at the difference, or what explains the difference between artificial design of body parts versus evolutionary design, is there any similar type of explanations of that difference when it comes to the brain compared to other parts of the body? We don't have wings and propellers and things like that for some reason.
So there's whole literature on biology-inspired design, and it's often in contrast to ordinary sort of design. And there are many sort of noticed elements. So, in terms of just physical design of architecture or devices, we tend to make nice rectilinear shapes, simple designs, because we can fit those together into, big piles of them. They're more modular, basically, in many ways. The standard things that humans would design. Things that biology designs tend to be more flexible, fluid, harder to predict, harder to integrate with other things, perhaps change. So again, my one working hypothesis, at least to start with, I don't claim it's the only thing, is that it's the difference between integration and modularity is the key distinction that I'm pushing here, and I hopefully will study more to find more ways to think about the difference.
Well, but I was asking about the explanations. How do you explain these differences? And is your explanation in the case of the brain similar to the explanations of differences when it comes to arms and legs and sensory organs and things like that?
It seems to be so far as I've looked, but I haven't looked very far, so
Okay.
I will continue to look. And if anybody has opinions, please speak up. I mean, I know, for example, Eric Drexler spent a long time thinking about the difference between biologically designed tiny machines and the kind of machines that humans design, and I remember a fair bit of that. And again, a lot of it comes down to modularity and standardization and scaling. That the kind of machines we would design are designed to be able to scale and designed to have replicated parts that would fit together in a scaled structure, and biology doesn't bother with that because it's usually not trying to think ahead to scale.
Okay.
I have a question on this. Considering how much of our cognition is embodied, how would we know that we've succeeded in creating some sort of human similar mind that is extracorporeal? It doesn't have any of the thinking processes that a human brain has because it's not in a human body. And secondly, if it is truly human, why would it be motivated to do any work for us?
So for the first one, I'm presuming, as many people do, that the hard part is the brain. You can give them bodies, and we have many bodies now that you can give. Certainly in virtual reality, we could just give them a virtual reality body that they would feel is like a body, or we could put them in android bodies, so they don't have to be disembodied. They can very much be embodied, but their bodies would be different than ours. And so you might ask, how different do they become because they are in a different body? But we already now know of how people change when they become quadriplegic or blind or et cetera. We actually see a lot of variety, and we see that when people, say, work a steam shovel or something, they usually work it in a way where they make the steam shovel feel as if it was their body. So we actually do mentally project onto a very wide range of bodies, and we can comfortably do that. And that seems to be part of our mental capacity. So on why they would do anything, I just observe the vast majority of humans in history have lived near subsistence level, as have pretty much all animals ever. And you might think, how could they get up in the morning? Why don't they just commit suicide? That might be how you feel about that, living in a rich world, but they didn't live in your world. they grow up in their world, and pretty much all of them do get up in the morning and don't commit suicide. So it just seems really robust that humans in a subsistence world do continue on.
Will they not rebel, though?
Against
If
who?
you mentioned some sort of world where they live and interact with each other, would they not rebel against us? Or would they
Against
not
who?
realize that they're
Against the
enslaved
humans,
by
or-
us? Yes.
Well, so I'm describing them a world where they're not enslaved. Like, you could imagine worlds where they're enslaved and then they might rebel, but I'm just imagining a world where they are born and they have a job and they do things and they're not as rich as they'd like to be, but people don't rebel just because they're not as rich as they'd like to be. You might think, why don't the M's all together expropriate the humans? And that may well happen, but it's not obvious. That is, there are many divisions on which conflict could occur, and then today we have retirees in our world that we don't kill them to take their stuff, plausibly because doing so would threaten the institutions we share with them. Everybody else would wonder who's next. Who else were we going to kill next after we killed the retirees because they're going to take their stuff? And maybe we just mostly don't want to go there. But I can't offer any guarantees. Those are just plausibility arguments. In generically, whenever there's a future where new production technologies and abilities show up, if some community decides to not adopt that, like the Amish or something, over time they become more and more vulnerable to the center of the world and what they choose about them. So the safest strategy is continue to find a way to be part of the most productive, most powerful parts of the world. And that's the scenario I'm talking about, how humans can continue, not just to be the rich capitalists on the side, but to be the center of productivity. The center of the cities, doing the most tangled tasks, which also happen to be the management tasks. Higher levels in organizations tend to be more tangled. Humans can continue to sit in those places, not by keeping control and keeping down rebellion, but by just being the best there.
How quickly do you expect that the existing humans will lose power in this new world compared to the emulations?
So again, if you mean humans who have not chosen to become emulations, then again, this whole age of M, for example, only plausibly lasts a year or two before something else happens. And so I could plausibly see it lasting a year or two. And then again, something else happens even stranger and even more alien. And so they are more and more at risk that more strange things happen. But as long as they're off on the side just spending their retirement income, we often let rich retired people spend their money without getting too involved in it because we all have other concerns and other issues. So that's plausible.
If we have outputs and once our software is not dependent on the physical structure, how likely is it that we will be able to maintain this package of interconnected modules rather than break it apart and enhance some modules and destroy others?
So for cells, evolution had the option to take these cells and rip out chunks and make a design for a new multicellular organism that had chunks from the cells, but maybe scaled up to be different and different structure. Evolution just couldn't figure out how to do that because it was really complicated. This was just a well-integrated package, and many of you today may have dealt with legacy software systems, and the actual fact of dealing with legacy software systems is even though you can easily look at any one line in the code and change any one line in the code, you still mostly don't understand it and are reluctant to make many changes because your experience is that changes have unpredictable effects and mess stuff up. So a large integrated software system is often something you just kind of have to leave alone, maybe add patches, add things onto it, or replace wholesale. But making large modifications is usually hard. That's called refactoring, and often people try to design things to be able to be refactored, and they try to refactor, and even then, software typically slowly gets more fragile, harder to adapt, harder to understand, and eventually gets tossed. That's just the world of legacy systems. So humans can hope to be that. Humans can hope to be the legacy software of the future world, something that works, but it's complicated and it's too messy to figure out how to change it, and you don't want to get rid of it because it's pretty good at some things, so we at least have a place in the future.
I presume this is all powered by electricity, and we get a good solar storm and it's all over.
Oh, well, hopefully they would anticipate that,
Right.
and at least not have all of their systems vulnerable, but again, their world would certainly be paying attention to those sorts of risks. But at least they're no longer vulnerable to all the other biological risks that we might be vulnerable to. Even global warming is hardly a risk for them. I mean, their hardware is going to be much more robust to temperature changes or humidity changes, etc. An EMP, they'll probably just cover their cities with aluminum foil. I mean, the whole damn city. There's a scale economy there. Instead of having each little package be covered, you just cover the whole damn city with aluminum foil. But after you do that, you might as well have a pressure dome under there to keep the dirt out. As you all know, computer equipment tends to be more sensitive to fluctuations of temperature, humidity, and dust and vibrations. So that's a scale, that's something the whole city services will provide. Basically, M cities or computer cities will basically have city services that keep the entire city at a modest temperature, humidity, pressure, fluctuate, vibrations, dust, etc. And EMP protection is just an easy thing to add on to all the rest of that. Yes, aluminum foil in the city.
Any more questions?
So I'll ask, does this offer any hope to you? Does this feel like a faint or a vain hope, or is this a plausible hope? Can you feel some hope here that even in a world where we have to compete with the machines and can't just take over and rule them, that we might not all die out, or something like us might continue? Anybody feeling any hope?
Yeah.
Anybody just completely despaired? No hope. All right, well, I've offered some hope.